Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rachel Levy, and I am an MA-PhD student at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. It is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Eleanor Sims. Dr. Sims is a renowned scholar, author, and professor of Islamic art, specializing in Persian painting and manuscripts. She received her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts in New York City. She has worked in the Islamic department of the Metropolitan Museum in New York and has taught the history of Islamic art in the United States and London. Dr. Sims organized a traveling lone exhibition of Islamic art to celebrate the 1400th anniversary of the Hijra. Her numerous publications include the 2002 award-winning volume, Peerless Images, Persian Painting and Its Sources. Since 1982, she has edited the journal Islamic Art with her late husband, Ernst J. Gruba. Today, she will be discussing 17th century Safavid Persian oil paintings in the Museum of Islamic Art. Please join me in welcoming Eleanor Sims.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, John and Sheila, for the initial invitation. To Franek, Susan, Costa, everyone else here in Qatar who made it possible for the study of these extraordinary pictures, and for all the friends and colleagues who've got me here today. Not least of all our Marissa and Andrew, who have borne with my technical inabilities. In a land, well, and Andrew can, we've lost their tops. They were there, and someone will do something about them. In a landmark exhibition of the arts of Persia at the Royal Academy in London in 1931, this pair of oil paintings that are going to come back to the screen, oil paintings on canvas showing nearly life-size man and woman in Persian court dress, was placed in a position of honor. That's a quote from the catalog, or the publication. Unusual in this Persian context, in size, in technique, and medium, the pictures nonetheless elicited no comment whatsoever in the subsequent exhibition catalog, right? In fact, they engendered absolutely nothing but silence for another 4 decades. When, in 1974, they emerged from deepest Wiltshire, where, according to family tradition, they had resided for nearly 300 years, they wandered. Since then, the paintings have been sold, separated, and relodged more than once. Moreover, each of the pair has traveled eastward, if separately, and now exactly 80 years from their very first public appearance, so to speak, they are reunited. And they have come to reside here in Qatar, along with no fewer than 4 other members of their generic clan. The 6 pictures embody the best of the genre, as well as the rest of the qualitative range. Among them is also the so far single known exception to the generic type: rectangular, late Safavid paintings of Orientals executed in oil on canvas, nearly life-size pictures of men and women usually presented as pairs and dressed in the typical garb of upper-class Persians and the Oriental Christians who lived among them. Such people would have looked wonderfully exotic to the many Europeans who visited the Safavid court throughout the 17th century. And as these visitors so very often recorded what they saw in words, so it is my contention, some of them wished a visual record, both to recall for themselves and to show to others the exotic peoples of those unfamiliar parts of the world from which they were returning. I must immediately say that in this 21st century, I am not certain that, at least at first glance, such paintings will strike every eye as beautiful. Indeed, they may seem unsettling, bizarre even, in their use of European techniques and materials for the representation of non-European subjects. Among other things, however, they remain the largest and the most striking examples of the eclectic mode of 17th century Safavid Persian paintings that have so far survived the troubled centuries since they were painted. I have to confess that when I first saw some of them, I too felt that they were odd in the extreme. Decades later, however, I feel that I have come to know them. I've known them all, even if there remains much that collectively we do not know about them. We don't know really who painted them. We're not certain from what background came these paintings, although what I am certain of is that they are not the work of Europeans, but of persons who learned their techniques from Europeans, and they worked hard at learning it. For, as we shall later see, when rather less well-trained Persian artists first reproduce Europeans and European fashions on a monumental scale, the results can be laughably clumsy. Bizarre, though the Persian oil paintings of the 17th century may still appear to some of you, they are not actually clumsily painted, although in 1975 and still now, they do not seem to come from, and I quote notes made at that point, any established school of painting. And we are not much further along in knowing for whom most of them were painted, nor more precisely when. But if none are dated, at least none to the best of my knowledge are dated, I'm also still convinced both that they date from no earlier than the second half of the 17th century, and that they are almost surely no later than the end of that century, perhaps even a decade or so earlier. But they do continue to exercise a fascination, of which the 6 paintings now here in Qatar are a remarkable gathering of almost all of the primary groups among them, as well as giving an example of the single exception so far recorded. So we're going to look at them all, beginning with the most visually complex of the 6. And she, as some of you will know, is on display upstairs. This lady is not the first of the group that I encountered so many years ago, but I did know her then from published pictures. And as she was then in Paris, we'll call her the Paris lady. She's a member of the most impressive suite of these Persian oil paintings on canvas. And for working purposes, I'm referring to it and have been for some time as the Prospect Suite. It's not a bad hotel anywhere in England, but you'll begin to see what I mean. It's after a type of 17th century painting type, the portrait with the prospect. The type was particularly popular for paintings in England for a very brief period, especially between right around 1630, even if the painters who often executed them were more often Flemish or Dutch rather than English. That's a perfectly classical type, a finely dressed figure of either a man or a woman who faces either right or left, stands on a marble floor, often checkered, rusty red and white. The space is implicitly the terrace of a very grand structure, for behind the figure is a large stone column. I'm not going to use this. I don't want them to jump. You'll see the pedestal and the column. And at either the upper right or the left background of the picture is the prospect, a spacious, distant, and indistinct landscape with water in the background, or at least the suggestion that, were the subject to turn his back to us, he would be gazing out over water lying under an atmospherically charged sky. The leading practitioner of this portrait type in London was the Dutch painter Daniel Meetens. He had come to England about 1618. By 1624, he'd won the favor of James I, and after him, he became court painter to his son and successor, Charles I, whom we've now been looking at. Paintings of this type, the portrait with the prospect whose subject are royal, also include a draped table next to the subject on which repose royal regalia, a crown, sometimes a scepter. Portraits of non-royal figures of the type, for instance, the first Duke of Hamilton, do not have this feature of the draped table. How clearly the lady belongs to this group should by now be evident. She too stands on a terrace paved with large squares of red and white marble, offering the chance to attempt an essay at European four-point perspective. Behind her is a pair of high pedestals supporting carved gray twisted columns wreathed with laden vines, large putti disport among them. Further behind her is a lower balustrade of reddish stone here, and beyond that, at the right, is the prospect, a view of a large, classically appearing round structure in the distance. Right. Behind it, there's this tower. Do I dare? Yeah, there's a round tower, smaller tower behind it. The view is fringed with foliage and overhung with puffy white clouds in a blue sky. Between the columns is a heavy curtain of green velvet with very long, thick golden fringes. The lady faces right, and beside her to the right is also a table. It's laden this time not with royal regalia, but with fruit, with sweetmeats, and a Venetian or a Bohemian clear glass decanter, which is partly filled with a red liquid, obviously red wine. In one hand, she holds a mixed nosegay, and in the other, a very tall Venetian or Bohemian wine glass with a very wide, shallow bowl, an elaborately shaped and exaggeratedly long stem. There is no apparent foot, however. At her own feet, on the terrace to the right front of the picture, stands a large, apparently metal vase with a bulbous body, a narrow neck, thick acanthus-like handles. It is filled with flowers, lilies, roses, tulips, and carnations. It's like a Dutch still life bouquet. And between her feet and the vase can be seen 1 foot of this famous table. Oh, sorry. Large, black, hairy, and it has claws. This is, in fact, a large, black, hairy beast's foot. Her clothing also calls for some comment. The silvery white robe is densely patterned with a curvilinear floral trellis scrolling through elongated cartouches with elaborate ends. The front closing and the hem are edged in a thin golden fabric with black-stemmed arabesques. Above the waist, the robe is tied with red bows. A red undergarment is seen above the bosom, and over the robe is a shorter, open, fur-lined, sleeveless, but fur-lined and fur-colored sleeveless jacket of a different red with a pattern of very large golden and darker red blooms. 2 white scarves wrap her head, a large one with wide golden border sprigged with floral sprays and fringed with the most delicate golden tied clumps of lace. This kind of detail is really quite extraordinary. The larger scarf is plain, and it kind of wraps around the head, and it wraps around the headdress. It's not so easy to see, but is much better seen in the galleries. This is a very tightly arranged row of golden coins. A few strands of dark hair can be seen at the brow and the side of the face. And lastly, the angled stripes of her trousers can be seen there. They show above wide golden cuffs, which are decorated with growing flowers in the Indian manner. Her high-heeled slippers are green. Bracelets at her wrist, a wide golden belt with red stones, and a large hanging disc complete this extraordinary ensemble. Now, while the Paris lady has no true companion in Doha, the lady we first looked at offers a fascinating and suggestive comparison. Let me first identify her and her mate, as they were consigned for auction in 1974 from the Wiltshire house called Bassett Down. The name clings usefully. She too faces right and stands on a checkered floor. This time it's red and black. She too wears a dress of the very same pattern with a similar golden edging. She too wears trousers that are diagonally striped. They end in wide golden floral pattern cuffs over high dark slippers. Different is that a loose sash is wound around her upper hips, and a little bit like a Mughal patka, but worn lower. The primary difference in their costume is the headdress. This is a high, narrow-crowned red cap in red fabric. It covers both head and ears. It's ringed above the brow with a delicate golden diadem. It's fixed with a string of pearls under the chin, and it's surmounted with a pair of aigrettes. One is the black heron feather spray that is also characteristic of Safavid princely headgear for both men and women. She too holds a flower in one hand and a drinking vessel in the other, but the flower this time is single, and the drinking cup is small. It's placed on a tray, then at her feet, there is another small tray. It's hard to see. Let's go back. It's very hard to see here. There are three probably blue and white cups. There is actually a globular bottle there. It's hard to tell if it's metal or glass. In other words, the setting is really very simplified, and instead of this very elaborate setting and this balustrade, behind her, in this murky and indistinct landscape, there is this sort of Chinese pattern, red painted, probably a wooden balustrade, and the landscape stretches indistinctly behind her. She seems to cast a very faint shadow behind her, whereas this lady's shadow is a little more distinct this way. The canvas on which she is painted is virtually the same size as that of the Paris lady, but the effect is of a much smaller image, probably because the setting is so simplified. Her male pendant, as we've seen in the beginning, faces left. He faces her and stands on the same terrace. There's a draped green curtain. It's now been much more cleaned and is much more visible than you see in this quite old picture of mine. A draped green curtain falls behind him to leave only a small bit of landscape there. It might, if you're just fanciful enough, be that jagged mountain that rises south of Isfahan, but maybe it's not. The pavement displays the same attempted perspective in its red and black checkered pavement squares. The squares slant from lower left to upper right. His clothing also seems simpler. Perhaps this is because pattern is largely absent, unlike the lady, the Paris lady we first looked at. There's a long orange coat with the welted edging and golden frogging under a dark overgarment. It's clasped at the waist by a wide fabric belt over which a short white, possibly ivory-handled dagger is stuck. He wears a short-shaped sleeveless jacket edged with floral trim. The color is fawn yellow, and we had some very quick discussion of this last week as to whether it was intended to be gold or whether it was a separate fabric. His huge turban is of striped cloth. It's wound in the classical 17th century Safavid shape. He's clean-shaven, but he does wear these exaggeratedly enormous mustaches of the style favored by Shah Abbas I, and they are so often depicted as a sign of homage through the century and well into the 18th century as well. With one hand, he touches his dagger. With the other, he holds a fruit, as if offering it to the lady whom he faces. In fact, faces are really a notable feature of this couple, albeit that his mustaches, which have the appearance of just being pasted onto the face, and her close-fitting red cap actually tend to obscure the similarity in the way both are executed. They're light in complexion, egg-shaped in face, shortish noses, and a small but full underlip, and for her, a pursing line at each side of the mouth. His mustache obscures that. One expert I consulted very early in this long adventure observed that the brush strokes of the faces are pure cliché. There is no freedom in the execution of either faces or hands. Yet that these paintings are a pair is very evident from the positions, the gestures, the settings. In this unified space, however simply it may be executed, each figure reaches out to the other, however stiff may be the representation. For contrast, then, let us turn to the man who is also upstairs in the galleries here in Doha. For the moment, I'm calling him the man with the cane. There are people who think that he actually looks like a textile colleague of ours. He has blue eyes and reddish blonde Abbasi mustaches. They're set in a peculiarly, the head is quite wonderful, but the head is peculiarly set on a torso with somewhat misaligned shoulders and arms that apparently really differ in length. One signet-ringed hand rests on a longish cane. His Safavid garments are extremely well observed and well painted. He stands facing to the right in a very indistinct interior with a luxuriant green curtain fringed in gold behind him. It partly falls over the very simplified prospect through the window at the upper right. You can only see a single tree with foliage that kind of marks the middle ground, and a more distant grove marks a further distance, and at the bottom left is a little white dog who peers out from behind him. From the moment this gentleman appeared for sale in 1997, he really did convey the sense of an individual. The head, so I noted in March of this year, was compelling. The garments painted by someone who really knew what such clothing looked like, down to the fine and barely visible black and white line that marks the pointed edge of the jama and runs down the instep of the slipper. He's also a considerably larger figure than the three other Doha paintings, certainly than the lady upstairs, as you can see them, really considerably larger. Indeed, he's larger than most of the other paintings of the overall rectangular group. His long robe shows the weight of the fabric at its welted hem, the undergarment of red and blue, an undergarment of red that's visible only at the neck. The red trousers are very simply rendered, but the long robe is really wonderful. You can feel the weight of the fabric as it bunches up at the welting if you go and look. The striped textile of the turban is very similar in appearance of fabric to that on the basset down man, even if the less expert winding results in a rather different shape. The golden coat, of course, recalls the famous Van Dyck portrait of Sir Robert Shirley, executed in Rome in the summer of 1622. It's interesting when I start to compare sizes. The size of the Shirley painting is very, very close to the size of the portrait upstairs. One is 2 meters by 133 and a fraction centimeters. The other is over 2 meters in height and 1.25 meters in width. This is notably closer, as I've just said, to the Van Dyck Shirley portrait, and even to this peculiar and anonymous portrait from the Berkeley Will Trust that is also supposed to be Sir Robert Shirley and is perhaps painted about 6 years later. In other words, in shape and size, as well as in the very compelling head, the painting of the man with the cane upstairs in the galleries really conforms to the European intention of capturing likeness that is implicit in the commissioning of a portrait. I would certainly concur with the original cataloger that the picture is indeed a portrait, even if we cannot yet identify who it was or who painted it. Surely it was executed in Persia. As such, it is then unique among the surviving rectangular Safavid paintings in oil. I really do think it's the only true portrait so far recorded. The last of the rectangular paintings here in Doha, even if they're not yet on display, are also a pair I have known since 1975. Smaller than any of the pictures we've so far seen, they show a beardless youth holding a strung bow and an arrow, and a maiden with a large metal bottle in one arm and a shallow cup filled with red liquid in the other hand. Each one has something at the lower left of the picture, 3 pomegranates in each case. He has a bottle full of red wine. They both stand facing right, but they gaze out at us in an open green landscape with a fairly low horizon. They both cast shadows behind them, up this way to the right. Very large shadows. You're not certain that this is corresponds to this, but note that the landscape is there, but extremely simple. They offer, therefore, a number of features on which to cogitate. The fur-brimmed hats suggest that they're Caucasian, if not also specifically Georgian. Thus, for me, they are the Georgians. In style, size, placement of figure, and landscape, they're clearly similar, but equally clearly, they are not the pendant pair, because they both face the same way. Implicit in this statement, then, is that there did at some point exist another such pair of pictures painted by exactly the same person in more or less the same kind of situation. They would be similar in size, in style, in the placement of figures of different genders, but they would both be looking to our left to face this youth and maiden. They too would have stood in the same landscape with the same low horizon, the same pink touch, pale blue sky. Considering what their subjects may have been and for what function they were painted raises, however, now a host of questions about them both and a number of others. And that's where we'll now go. These 6 paintings here in Doha constitute half of the presently known best pictures of this overall type. The other 6 fall rather neatly into 2 groups of 3. Both have important connections to the Doha 6, and we'll only look, I think, at one of these groups. They are pictures that were among my original introduction to this genre. Pictures, I think these 2 are part of the same quote-unquote prospect suite that the lady upstairs is. They're both in Tehran. They were in the Saadabad Palace, and I did see them in Iran in 2005, so there's no question that they exist still. As you see, the settings include exactly the same elements: the red and white marble checkered floor, the gray column on the high pedestal, the shorter red balustrade beyond, to which at either right or left, depending on whether the person faces left or right, is the prospect, framed with rich drapery. There's always a table laid with European objects or fruit, and the European or European-style metal vase with its fleshy acanthus handles is either on the floor in front of the figure or, in the case of the lady now on the left of the screen, clutched in her arm. The lady in particular recalls, of course, the lady upstairs. Her stance, her position, the cut, and the silvery fabric of her dress are virtually the same as that of the Paris lady and also the Basset Down lady. The differences lie in minor variations of pose and accessories, primarily in the headgear. Costume and headgear, as so often in the East, as in medieval and Renaissance Europe, being an indication of nationality, status, religion, or all of these. Thus, the Paris lady upstairs, in her headdress with golden coins at the brow, is Armenian. For comparison, here is a 19th century painting. In this case, it might well be a portrait of an Armenian by an Armenian painter of an Armenian lady. Alas, I cannot tell you by whom or of whom, because the details are still with Yale Press, but they are known. Compare her headdress with the coins, the brow, there's no question. In the same way, the Tehran lady is Georgian. It's evident apparently not only from her headdress. You can see in comparison with these pictures by Prince Gagarin made in the 19th century of frescoes in one of the churches, I think in Msheta in Georgia. But also this lady holds a very large drinking horn that I have no doubt, because various friends have convinced me, and also I have received gifts like this from Georgia, this is a Georgian object. Let me emphasize, however, that both of the ladies, the Paris lady and the Tehran lady, face right, so one obvious pendant or pairing is, of course, the man from Tehran who faces to the left. His garb is unmistakably Safavid Persian from the 17th century, from his huge striped turban down to his dark green slippers. There are 3 paintings known from this suite. I make that implicitly 4, because each would have had a pendant. His garb, yes, there are 3 or 4 pictures of similar size, style, setting, content, quality, showing the three principal national or religious personages a European visitor would have encountered in any sojourn in Isfahan. It's really very hard, and has been for many years for me, to escape the conviction that these pictures were executed as a suite, a large decorative ensemble picturing the typical denizens of the realm of the great Sophie, when Isfahan truly was half the world. Moreover, suites or sets or ensembles, in other words, multiples of images or ornaments or features, are fundamental of the Persian aesthetic. They had been for centuries prior. Multiple projecting bosses on medieval metalwork, many tiny units of a decorative revetment of tile or reflecting mirror glass, symmetrical numbers of multiple niches in an interior, or the paintings to fill those niches. Speaking of architectural decoration, quite naturally leads to size. It's of course useful in making connections between various objects, although it's hardly an infallible diagnostic since independent paintings on canvas are so easily cut down. Shape, however, is really another matter. And so I turn now for some background to the larger setting in which I have long conjectured that these oil-painted images of 17th century Persian types were created, for some of the royal buildings in Isfahan and their reflections in houses of the Armenian community of New Jolfa across the Zayande River. Most here will know it, but it does no harm to reiterate it, particularly since I didn't think to have any pictures of this, that the pavilion come entry to the 17th century garden zone of Isfahan that lay behind the great new Maidan of Shah Abbas I is called the Ali Rapu, the lofty gateway. Most of you will perhaps appreciate that it was once decorated with painted figural decoration in many scales, many places, many types and styles. Interior audience halls, exterior audience porches, and of course the so-called music box at the very topmost story of the building. Technically, this building is dateless, although the pictures can be dated to the first several decades of the century, up to perhaps 1630 or so. Slightly later in the century, Shah Abbas II built for himself the audience palace of which this is one of the side talars. It's much deeper into the garden zone. It was called the Chehel Sutun, the Palace of the 40 Columns. It has only one date, although this is even an 18th century copy of the original inscription, and it's in on top of that a chronogram, but it yields the date 1057, which is equivalent to 1647, which is about 5 years into the reign of Shah Abbas II. The date of the building and paintings has been much discussed. Here it will suffice to say that it was built in the reign of Abbas II between 1642 and 1666, and that the paintings that cover it inside and out, porches, audience hall, entry hall, back talars, are datable in those years, but probably closer to mid-century. For the Chehel Sutun is really a key document relative to these oil paintings, much more so than the Ali Rapu was, or any of the other buildings that no longer exist. Its walls are painted virtually all over, inside and out, and in all the styles that were current in the Safavid capital and elsewhere in that period. The great audience hall in the interior has been well studied, much reproduced. The series of exotic-looking Europeans on its exterior talars much less so, especially because in the years in which I was working there, as you can see, it was so often covered with scaffolding. So I'll show you several of the most evocative from among the figures painted in niches with pointed tops in the south talar. The lady on the left is the one I'm speaking of. She's dark-haired. Her coiffure and hair and feather aigrette are absolutely Safavid, but her clothing is not only archaic, but most uncertain national origin. The owner thinks that it depicts a Persian ambassador to the court of Louis XIII. I've not so far been able to document this, and anyone else who has information to the contrary will be most gratefully received. What this very beautiful drawing does underscore, however, is the veracity of the rendition of clothing and textiles in the best of the 17th century Persian oil paintings, the Prospect Suite and the Man with the Cane upstairs. The textures of fur and fine undergarments the welting of edges, the gold fitting for the heron figure aigrette. Dumonstier really does them wonderfully, but the painters of our groups of the best pictures are reasonably equal to the task, as the Chehel Satoun painters really were not, at least not on these side talars. Yet one of the things that again always accompanies these Chehel Satoun pictures, will I get it right? There's always a draped curtain. There's a draped curtain there. This is very difficult to see. You've seen all the draped curtains in the oil pictures. In other words, that's one of the things that's always there. And this is a motif that consistently then appears in much later manuscript pictures all the way up to the late 19th century. The Chehel Satoun's many eclectically rendered exotic figural paintings were not unique in Shah Abbas II's capital. Smaller figures, but maybe they're not small, we can't tell, are to be seen in a drawing of the contemporary Aïn Khaneh. It stood near the banks of the Zayande River. It was destroyed by Zillah Sultan, but suddenly working on something totally different early this year, I realized that, that here, and I think there, this might be a woman, this is a man, shorter jama. The Aïn Khaneh also had large oil paintings on its talar. They can also be found in Nujolfa across the river. The Dutch traveler Cornelius de Bruyn describes a house of Hwaju Sarfraz having, quote, all the walls painted and full of figures as big as the life, a Turkish man and woman, other figures dressed after the Persian and Spanish manner. In other words, we have Europeans, they're exotic types, they're different, and they're types, and they come from varieties of parts of the world that were not so well known necessarily to the Armenians. From some other house, there's this fragment of wall painting on plaster. It's well known to many of you. It's been shown in a number of exhibitions. So these people are Georgians. One lady in the white headdress, you've seen her before. It's this. And of course, what he's carrying is a dish with a piglet, or maybe more than one, I can't tell from here, which of course classically identifies them as non-Muslims. But again, they all show figural types that would have been exotic in the Armenian to the Armenian owners, European and Persian men and women, Georgian women, Indian men. There's an Indian man behind my old friend John Carswell on the other side of this talar. That was he making the drawings for his important study published in 1968. And so one sees that suites of these pictures with pointed tops, unless they were filler ornament there, and even the upper one here has a pointed top, that's absolutely standard in Armenian Isfahan late in the 17th century. They're painted directly onto the walls. They were, of course, subject to the slings and arrows of time, war, weather, urban deterioration, benign neglect, and restoration. Nonetheless, as they remain today, it's evident that so many of these mural subjects are essentially the same as our oil on canvas subjects, not to speak of the ammunition they provide for those among my oldest and dearest colleagues who have always argued for the fact that these peculiar paintings are Armenian paintings. They've argued for the Armenian authorship of these types, not only for the pictures painted onto the plastered walls, as here in Nujolfa, but also onto primed canvas, in just the same way that other old and dear friends and colleagues have equally argued for the fact that these paintings are Georgian, made by Georgians of Georgians. But does an Armenian or a Georgian context or subject ipso facto denote that the painter was Armenian or Georgian? Painter, subject, context. I myself am still uncertain, but then others have long been uncertain. And once again, as I went back, I prepared for this, I found in consulting my earliest notes the comment that while the painters in question had surely learned their techniques from Europeans, none of these pictures appear to be, quote, from any established school of painting. We know, of course, that during the next century, painting in oil on canvas became an established genre of Persian artists, which endured really well into the 20th century. Nonetheless, in the 18th century, the persons painting these pictures had not always totally learned their lessons, or they had not adhered to what they learned. I think that this particular picture is a wonderful example. This blonde, curly-haired, beautiful young man is wearing underneath a red coat, red jacket, that is this typical red broadcloth that is the clothing that the redcoats wore in the 18th century. What he's wearing it over is, of course, a Persian jama. You see it here with its welted edging, maybe it's pearl-edged, and the sash that ties it. Picture has a pointed shape, so it has a point, but it's wrapped, the canvas is just wrapped around the stretchers. But much more important, and I think you can see it in this detail, the canvas has been stretched on the diagonal. I'm told by people who know European painting, and I have bothered some of them about it, that it is very rare for canvas or a cloth support to be stretched on the diagonal. There are all kinds of things that happen when you move textiles on the bias, and stretching a painted canvas as a support for this on the diagonal was not exactly best practice. One more painting that really now should enter the discussion is this picture. It's differing only slightly from others of similar size, setting, and the manner of its provenance. All the other paintings that we've so far seen and considered have come either from English or continental collections. Often they've been in place for close to 3 centuries. This painting, said the Sotheby's catalog, it was sold in New York in 2005, had traveled still further, and it was last consigned for sale from an American collection. But from wherever its prior home may have been, I have come to consider it as a kind of chronological and stylistic fulcrum for the whole matter, for reasons which I think will soon be apparent. Let me first offer some comments on its most recently published title. It is neither a portrait, nor does it depict a noble man. It is instead another painting of a Persian lady in the rich and complex setting of one version of the Prospect Suite. She too wears diagonally striped trousers and a sash loosely draped around the hips. She wears a very long pair of earrings as opposed to a single one. She wears multiple braids. The bosom, it is true, is quite indistinctly rendered, and I expect that's what misled the cataloger. On the white draped table beside her are fruits rather than coins and a timepiece, as in the Tehran man. Also, as with our Georgian and Armenian ladies of the Prospect Suite. Moreover, the painting is rectangular, as are all the other oil-painted pictures we have so far looked at. Consider then this parallel. It's the same lady. She's been flipped. Clothing here is much simpler. There's no pattern on the dress, but there is the same gold border with the black arabesques, the same wide golden cuffs. You can see a little bit of striping there. The frogging of the closure here, that's a somewhat later period style of the later 18th century, is very similar to the frogging here. The sash is wrapped around the waist. Even the hands, the arms are in the same position, sort of held like this. The face is the same. They wear the same kind of headgear. She's been flipped. And she was always intended to be in a painting of this shape, particularly when it was curved. It's not that it's a rectangular painting whose top was cut off, because she extends right up there to the same way. I have not compared the measurements, I have to say that, so you can't ask because I won't be able to tell you. She's been reversed and reused for this painting, made for the more traditional Persian pointed niche, or at least in an echo of that shape as this picture, which is in oil on canvas, stretched on stretcher boards, hung upon a wall. And I am proposing that that is exactly what this lady did in the company of a companion of this lady. She's been seen a number of times at sale recently. It's the same face. Costume is very different. Costume is always what's going to set them aside. Even the striped leggings, and here we can even see exactly how they were constructed thanks to this wonderful transparent overgarment. I think I saw it briefly in looking at John's Armenian picture book. I think she has a parallel on the walls of the House of Sukas in Isfahan. I think that this man is another parallel. He was presented to me some years ago to look at. I recently asked the person who'd first reported it to me, and all I was told was, he's somewhere in Iran. Saw him years ago. So if anyone meets up with him, please let me know. What, then, are we to conclude from all of this? I would suggest that in these full-length Safavid Persian paintings in oil pigments on canvas, we're looking at a later 17th century phenomenon with what I now think is a relatively short life. I think it would have lasted in Persia no later than about 1690. The origin is very complex, and it acquired a very particular profile in 17th century Isfahan. In the early, all of these things that I'm going to enumerate, I think, gave rise to this very short phenomenon. The earlier 17th century presence of Europeans and European books, reproductive prints, printed books, oil paintings, particularly those that came as gifts or for sale, but particularly the princely gifts that were carried by the embassies of trade and diplomacy sent by the crowned heads of Europe to the great Sophie. In a context in which the representation of foreigners became a fashion that was really favored by royalty, that would then, of course, have become widely imitated all over Isfahan in the presence of a certain number of European painters. If they were of little talent, then they were certainly people of great adventure and great energy who knew how to paint in oils or had learned to paint in oils on rectangularly stretched canvas supports, and who appear to have taught willing non-European painters. I'm sorry, I've garbled that, but I'm having trouble reading with a replacement pair of spectacles. These painters of not much talent but a lot of energy taught all kinds of people, including the Shahs of Persia, to paint in oils, and we have documentary accounts of many of these things. In the context in which transplanted Armenians built in their new city of Jolfa new churches, and they decorated them with acres, just acres of indifferent but absolutely standard European paintings in oil on canvas, as also in the presence of Europeans who liked the exotic human variety they found in Isfahan. They wished to recall it when they returned to their homes, and they thus commissioned, I believe, such pictures from local painting ateliers. I'm sure these ateliers must have been few, but none of them operated in ignorance of what the others were doing. Out of all of these features, I would suggest, a kind of critical mass was reached in the second half of the 17th century. From it emerged this striking, bizarre, but sometimes absolutely brilliant vogue for large rectangular paintings showing men and women in Persian dress, in oil, on canvas, whose manifestations have engaged us this afternoon. That such paintings are virtually never true portraits, the single exception probably being here in Doha, should now, I hope, be clear. Instead, that they are the work of related studios should also be clear, from the similarity of faces that sometimes overrides even differences in gender, from the similarity of materials, objects, and things in so many of these pictures. I think this same silvery trellis pattern dress exists in 4 pictures, one set of which I haven't even shown you because time was quite limited. from the flipping of images, even for paintings of different shapes, as we've just seen, and from the repetition of settings filled with what may, in the end, be thought of as studio props, astonishing as these sometimes may be. Consider this last pair of images. It's a pair of later 19th or early 20th century photographs from a very fine studio in Tbilisi. The lady is Princess Cholokashvili. The man is an unknown nobleman, at least that's what my Georgian informants tell me, and they are both accompanied by one of the most astonishing pieces of early Islamic metalwork, that famous and extraordinary Umayyad ewer, which is dated 69 of the Hijra, that's 688-89, which is now in the National Museum of Georgia, about which at some place, and I cannot recall, the late Oleg Grabar once wrote in such tantalized frustration as knowing about it, hearing about it, but not being able to find a photograph of it. That's now, of course, been rectified. We know that he's written at great length about it, and those of us who've either been to Georgia or have heard Irina Koshoridze talk about it in London will know very well. But it is, it stands like this, and there it is. But here it is as a studio prop in early 20th century Georgia. So I submit that these photographs are, in a sense, the 20th century equivalent of our 17th century oil paintings of Persians, Armenians, and Georgians from Isfahan. Images of people from parts unknown, commissioned or purchased by European travelers to those parts to take home to Northamptonshire or Wiltshire or places I do not yet know about, and serving to recall for them the exotically garbed people they had seen in parts of the world previously unknown to them. Thank you.
Well, I was going to say somewhat indiscreetly that it's great having an old pro, but I don't mean it in that way. I mean a pro end up with, and thank you, Eleanor, for such a wonderful and perfect end, taking us to the realm of photography, which is one of the things that we aren't talking about. But may I invite today's speakers to come up? As you will imagine, Rachel is not going to be able to join us, but no, I'm not answering questions for Rachel. But please come up, and we'll have a few minutes. We have about, maybe I would say just about 10 or 12 minutes for a few questions, and then we'll have, Sheila and I will have a few closing remarks, just as people are getting themselves settled.